The letter Tav. Let me show you what it looks like first as we get started here. Got one correction here. The Paleo letter Tav is basically an X shape. Frank Sakin's books talks about it. You can spin these letters around. It could be rendered as a cross shape. The modern letter, that looks like a het. The modern letter het. If it was a modern letter hey, it would have a space there. It looks like the modern letter het, but it's got a foot. So that's the modern letter Tav. Before we get into all this what means, let me just tell you one little interesting thing. I was looking on the internet for just briefly what some other people might say about the letter Tav. To get a little bit of a contrast, what we're trying to do with this class compared to other teachings that you might find. And one of the things that Jewish, you might say studiers of the alphabet do, is that they try to look at the modern flame letters and extrapolate a significance about those particular shapes. So what they do with this letter is they say, well, this is the letter Dalet in modern, and this is the letter Nun. So if you raise that up, it ends up looking like this. So that means this letter Tav is a combination of the letter Dalet and Nun. The problem with that is that in modern Hebrew, the letter Nun at the end of the word wouldn't have this foot there. It would be like that, which doesn't really look like that. Nevertheless, when they study the shapes of the letters, they'll say, well, anything that has a straight shape is a Vav. So an Aleph is like a Vav, and then you've got this, which is that's kind of like a foot of a gimel, and then it's got this here, and so that's like a yod, it's a little mark. And so then they'll say, well, how can the aleph have all these other letters embedded in it? I try not to deal with that. But just so you know, if you read other studies, you might find them interesting. But what this class is trying to be has nothing to do with that stuff. It also really has not much to do with gematria. Jamie's mentioned gematria. And just to clarify, this is the last letter, so just to kind of wrap everything all up. Gematria is simply taking the place of each letter and assigning a numerical value so that then you can count the total sum of the value of each particular word. For example, Aleph is 1, Bet is 2, Gimel's 3. When you get to Yod, that's the 10th letter. And though Kaf is the 11th letter, it counts as 20. So once it gets up to 10, it starts jumping in 10 increments. So it goes 10, 20, 30, 40. And then it gets up to 100, and then it jumps to 200, 300, 400. So Sheen would be 400, even though it's the 22nd letter. So there's different ways of rendering it. One of the things my wife looks at is the fact that the Samik is the 15th letter. And the 15th day of the first month, does anybody know what special thing we're supposed to observe the 15th day of the first month? Nope. Passover is the 14th day. What's the 15th day? The first day of the festival of Chag, which means festival Hamatzot. And I'll throw these little things in. I'm trying to, bring little things into you. In Hebrew, the word Chag is festival. It's actually feast. It's spelled Het Gimel. Is that hard to remember for anyone? Chag meaning festival or feast. Feast where you have a big party, everybody gets together. I'll show you an easy way to remember it. What's the one animal that people who are non-Hebrew love to cook up for a giant feast, like maybe a luau? A hog. It's the same word. They find the animal, the hog, is what they serve at the Chag, right? Because it's the big animal that's enough for everybody to feast on. There's all kinds of things like that in English compared to Hebrew. So that's just one of those little things to play around with. But the idea is the 15th day of the first month. What significant thing happened on the 15th day in history of the first month? Besides it being the first day of unleavened bread, does anybody know what major important thing happened on that 15th day? The Exodus out of Egypt. It said they left in one day. Well, if you look at the month calendar, in Hebrew time it goes by the moon. Of course, there is a couple other calendars there that don't go by the moon. That's another story. But those who go by the moon, there's generally either a 29 or a 30-day month, which puts the 15th at the full moon. So the interesting thing is the letter Samech lines up with the menorah, 15th letter, and the menorah is the light inside the dark place of inside the tent, that otherwise there would be no light. So, and it lines up with the 4th day of creation, where he put the sun, the moon, and the stars in the sky, the lights in the sky. Well, here's the menorah that produces light, and here's the day that he put lights in the sky, and it happens to line up with the 15th day of the month, which is the full moon, which is the light at night, by which they could walk out. That's the day of the Exodus, right? So he lit the sky up, as it were, so that they could have a night light for the Exodus. It's also the first day of the festival of the 15th day in the 7th month, which is coming up in just a week and a half or so, which is the first day of Sukkot. It's a mandatory non-work day, a mandatory gathering. So when you play around with these letters, you could say, well, does Samech equal the 15th letter? Or you go back and say, well, if Yod is 10, Kaf is 11, Lamed 30, Mem is 40, Nun is 50, Samech then is 60. So you could either render it as a 60 or the 15th. And another thing that my wife does, it's not gematria, but she's just kind of playing around and looking at things. That in the scriptures it might say, well, on the 3rd month and the 14th day and this and that, and tries to take those numbers that are there and say, well, if it's a 3rd month, that's a 3, and the 14th day, that's a 14, which letter is a 14, that's Nun, and Gimel Nun, Gan. Well, that's a garden. Is there another secret code written in just looking at the numbers that are provided? Maybe. Maybe it is, maybe it's not, but it's worth looking at. So, for example, you could say, we talked about this before, but I'm trying to rehearse and go back over some things just so maybe now at the end of the class I'll say some things that I might have said earlier in the class and that you might say, oh, wait a minute, now I seem to remember what that might mean, because now you have the experience of the whole class, right? So, the word Oregon, this state, Oregon. Has anybody ever thought of what that would mean in Hebrew? Has there anybody not thought of what it might mean in Hebrew? Does anybody never even think about it? You hadn't thought about it? You had never heard me mention it? No. Okay, so here, these guys, we'll just take them as shine the spotlight on them. You've never heard me mention it, so I'm not going to give it away. What do you suppose in Hebrew the word Oregon might mean? Do you know enough Hebrew to figure it out? Okay, the word or is light, right? Do you know if you put the suffix, the last phonetic sound of E at the end of a word, do you know what that does? Do you know what letter that would be? Here, look. You're right, it's Yod. So here's the thing. Or might be Aleph, Vav, Resh. If it's a menorah, it's actually Mem, Nun. That means the place from which something emerges from, right? Mem is like an egg, and Nun is like the thing birthed, or the Mem is water, and Nun is the fish that jumps out. So Mem Nun is like the word manna, means from where? Where did this thing come from? So Mem Nun has to do with the source and the projecting out. So Mem Nun, Vav, Resh, that's the or. Aleph, Vav, Resh is also or. Menorah, so you have a hey, which means to reveal or put on display. So the place from which light is put on display. That's literally the word menorah. So here you have this shape of a menorah, and we say, oh, that's a certain shape. This is a menorah. That's the place from which light is put on display. Any source of light is a menorah, technically. But since nobody speaks Hebrew except the Jews or the Israelis, then you say, oh, well, this is their menorah, because that's the one that Yahweh described and told how to make. Certain things have become Hebrew, though they're not necessarily exclusively Hebrew, is what I'm trying to say. So if you put the word or and have a yod, you could put this with a yod at the end, and it would say ori, or you might just have Vav Resh with a Yod, and that would also say Ori. I don't know how you'd exactly spell it, but let's just say it's like that because the word Or, so Ori, and then you have the other syllable Gan, Gimel Nun. Do you know what that means? Gimel Nun. To go out? Okay, kind of. If you're going to go out, say if you're indoors, say it's a nice day outside. You say, boy, I want to go out. Where would you go walking if you were, say, in your house? I mean, you could go to the city and walk around, but otherwise, where might you go out? To the garden. Generally, what a garden is, you have your house, and then you take the land right around your house, and you make it a nice place to go. So that if you walk, you'd walk in your garden. Now, if your garden was full of weeds and a bunch of chores like my place, you go, I don't want to look at my garden. I want to go to somebody else's garden who's taking better care of it, so I can just relax and appreciate. When you do landscape design, if you're going to design a garden just right, you might put a path to where out in front of you that's beckoning you is a nice colored tree or certain flowers, a certain time of the year. And as the path turns, you might get a certain fragrance. So you might embed different textures of leaves and different scents and different colors. And if you lay it out just right, put certain rocks, it's a really nice place. The interesting thing about the word Eretz, earth, Aleph, Resh, Zadi. The word Resh Zadi means a runner or a sprinter or a courier, which is one who has a route. So if you were a quarter-mile track runner, what would be your route? The quarter-mile track. Well, the word Aleph Resh in the dictionary here, the Red Ernest Cline's dictionary, doesn't have that as actually a word, but it says it's a French word having to do with area. That's R. So you might say the area or the track that the runner runs on. So you picture Yahweh. These letters all express Yahweh's purpose and intention. What is he saying in the letters? Aleph, I will. Bet, put something in a material form. Gimel is the letter with a foot. So in modern Hebrew, it's this letter, and it's got this little foot. In Hebrew, Paleo-Hebrew, it's just the top half of this. It's kind of like the camel's head and neck. But it's the letter that moves. Remember we said it was like a transport. It goes back and forth like a truck on a highway, or it's a boomerang, that which goes out and comes back. If you're going to go out for a walk in the garden, you're just going to go out, take a stroll, and come back. And the letter Nun at the end basically means to engage into the action of doing it. So Aleph Bet Gimel basically says, I will. Now remember, here's the Almighty. Let's just take a step back before the creation of the world. Here's the Almighty. He can do anything he wants. He can do anything he wants, including manifest himself into a form to have a certain experience if he wanted to. He could turn himself into a bug to see what it was like to be a bug. He could turn himself into a planet if he wanted to. I'm kind of being ridiculous, but not really. Because some people have said he would never take on the physical form of a human being. That's outrageous. He just wouldn't do it. He can do anything he wants. Why not? Why wouldn't he do it? He can do anything he wants. But Aleph Bet Gimel says, I will bet, incorporate into physical manifestation, a foot, Gimel. I'm going to give myself a foot. Where are you going to put your foot? In your garden. Ori, Gan, Or means a light, Ori means my light, and Gan is a garden. Oregon, my light garden. Now, if you've ever seen Oregon in the springtime or in the fall, and the colors, after a nice rain, the sun coming through the trees, the University of Oregon's colors are green and gold. Brilliant yellow, not gold, but brilliant yellow. When you see Oregon in the afternoon, especially before there was buildings here, this place is a garden of light. Who named this place? Was it Solomon's men that sailed around the world in their ships back in the 1000 BC era? Was it the Native American Indians? I mentioned once before, I believe, at the end of the Oregon Trail Center, they had a sign up that said nobody knows where the word Oregon came from. It was already here. Who named this place? You go back to Hebrew, And if Yahweh's going to make the earth, why? He's going to make himself a foot. This is like his garden villa. He says, heaven is my throne and earth is my footstool. There's a verse that says that. And so what do you picture? You picture this guy sitting back on his throne and his feet up on a footstool, right? But wait a minute. If you look close at the word footstool, what it actually means is, in Hebrew, the place you put your feet. Now, if you're sitting back, you're going to put your feet up on a footstool. But if you want to give yourself a foot and go for a walk, where do you put your feet? In your garden. So to think Yahweh made the planet Earth as the garden for him to go walking, having made himself a foot, suddenly you see the picture completely different. And that's the point of studying these letters, is to change the way we see what we think the story always told us. And it's like, yeah, but you only see it a certain way because you're predisposed to seeing it that way, because somebody told you that, or we inherited it. There's some pictures, for example, in medieval cathedrals that people didn't read and write. How did they tell the Bible stories? Stained glass windows. Very expensive, incredibly skilled craftsmanship. But here you have all these different stained glass windows. You might have a picture of David and Goliath. You might have a picture of the crucifixion. You might have a picture of the Garden of Eden. So you have Adam and Eve, and you got the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and there's a snake in the tree. And the snake in the tree, remember, was the devil that convinced Adam and Eve to eat the apple. Doesn't that sound like the story you remember hearing? You know that never happened? It never happened. Why do we think it happened? It's in the stained glass window, and we don't read. You see, even if you read English, the serpent talked to Adam and Eve, and it was after Yahweh came and everybody got in big trouble that he plucked the legs off the serpent and made him into a snake. There was no snake in the tree. We've got the context different. You see what I'm saying? There was no snake in the tree. I was at a meeting once and somebody said, gosh, how did they know whether the snake was lying or not? Well, if there's a snake in the tree, then you're not supposed to eat of the tree, then I'm not even going to talk to that snake. And it's like, there was no snake in the tree. I'm just trying to say, the event, I'm sure, happened. I don't think it was just merely metaphorical. But what I'm saying is that, we have to look at these words that we've been given and go back and rethink. We've inherited stuff that were stories about stories about stories and translated to different languages. And the whole reason for doing this is to go back. So to sit there and say Oregon might be my light garden. Well, here, to jump back on the track of this letter Tav, Dalet Nun is the word Dan. And so this fellow who was talking about the word Tav, the letter Tav, associating it to Dalet Nun, says the tribe of Dan was the last tribe to egress when they picked up the Mishkan and they all marched out of the camp. And so being the last tribe, they would pick up all the stuff that everybody dropped along the way. And the word Dan means to judge or to decide. So here you have a bunch of judgmental scavengers, picking up everything that everybody else discards along, tailing up the end. That's a joke. The point is, you could get somewhere. And I'm not saying that that's not true, but what I'm saying is we're not even going there with the study of these letters, even though I just went there. You'll find, if you look in Lou White's book, I believe it is, Fossilized Customs, this symbol right here, this cross, was actually, he says, the sign of Tammuz. And there's artifacts or pictures of people wearing headbands with these little plus signs as the sign of Tammuz. Well, remember, Tammuz was the son of Nimrod and Semiramis, and who was the guy responsible for everybody getting in big trouble, worshiping other deities, Tower of Babel, nothing good, Easter. So some might say, well, some people don't like the symbol of the cross, this T, this plus sign, because it's the letter T for Tammuz. If you write in Paleo an X with a circle around it, that's the letter Tet, the 9th letter. And they say, that's a snake. That's an evil letter. It's like we talked about this with the letter snake. It's not necessarily evil, because what it means is something that coils around. Well, a snake coils around, so the image of a snake coiling is in the Tet, but it doesn't mean Tet necessarily means snake. And just because we think snakes are evil, doesn't mean that tet's evil. The other thing about a snake is that it has a bitey, fang this end, and then it wraps around and it coils up. And so this is the shape of the modern letter tet. And you can kind of see the image of the snake. You got offense and defense. So with the letter tet, I came with a shield and a sword. There's pictures in these letters. I'm just trying to show the pictures. But the tet also means a full basket. Why a full basket? When you make a basket, you take the fibers and you go, whether it's rope or sticks, and you go around and around and around and around. So there's something about tet which is around and around until it's filled up. The relationship between tet and tav is that the tav is the end of the encircling of the alphabet. And if you go around and around, the cycle of the year, tet is like, it represents whatever's at the end. So again, there's these pictures within it. Now, the other interesting thing about the symbol of the cross shape, besides it being Tammuz's insignia letter, the Christian church uses the cross. Apparently, Constantine had a vision from wherever he got it, who knows, but it was outside of him, and it said, he saw this picture of this cross up by the sun, and it said, in this sign, conquer. In this sign, conquer. Well, the interesting thing is that the official religion of the Roman Empire was sun god worship, particularly a fellow named Mithra, or a Mazda, where like the car company was another name, and I think of more of the Persian. Nevertheless, it was the sun deity, and the image of the sun was a circle, like the orb of the sun. And then if you look at the longest day and the shortest day, the solstices, you have the shortest day, the winter solstice, the longest day, the summer solstice, and then you have the vernal and the autumnal equinoxes, which are equal days, and they're like that. And, you might have a little sun business going on here. But some people look at that and say, oh, well, wait a minute, no, that's the monstrance. That's the Catholic symbol of the holy deity. And then you go, well, that's a symbol of the sun god. And I remember seeing some crosses on Celtic gravestones from before the Christian era. And when I first saw them, I thought, what? Somehow the Christian message, the gospel must have gotten to these guys, because look, on their gravestones, they've got Christian crosses on Celtic ancient graves in England and Ireland and Scotland. It's like, it was sun god worship. It wasn't Christian. So when you see one of these symbols, how do you tell the difference between whether it's Christian or sun god worship? That's another story. You can read Fossilized Customs and Too Long in the Sun and come out of Here, My People, and you'll get some insight on that. A few different books. The point is, to look at this letter Tav and associate it with the cross is not necessarily the cleanest, most accurate rendering of what this letter means. Although, if you read Frank Seekin's book, whenever he writes the letter Tav, there's the sign of the cross. So you might say, if you read the word Shabbat with certain renderings, you might have Shin Bet Tav. How might you read this? Frank Seekin's work is excellent as a beginning place to become familiar with the language and the pictographic imagery and the evolution of how the letters change through certain eras. But he'll say, for example, the letter Shin is teeth, fire, and it means to consume. So consuming maybe is one way. Bet means a house, and Tav is the sign of the cross. So you could look at that and say, well, gee, if teeth is fire, you could say, well, it's the fire of the house of the cross, or it's the teeth of the house of the cross, or it's that which you consume. So it's the food, it's the substance provided, El Shaddai, the providing one, the Shin, the provisions for the house of the cross. And you could look at that and say, that's the Shabbat? Well, maybe you can do that. I'm not saying that's wrong, but we're going to look at a few other things within that particular word, especially in the second half of this. What I'm trying to say is there's a lot of different ways to read these words. There's the gematria, assigning number value, and then one of the things people do, for example, Dave Matthews, he must have a list. And I don't know if there's an official book I heard somewhere that only certain rabbis were allowed to interpret where these numbers come from. So maybe Dave Matthews has one of those books that somebody came up with. Maybe he's just figuring it out. I don't know. And I'm certainly not saying it's wrong, but what I'm saying is that he reads a word or he counts how many letters are in a certain sentence or in a verse, and he comes with a number. And what you can do, if you come up with a number that's like 27, that's a 2 and a 7. Well, 2 plus 7 is 9, so you reduce it down to a single digit. If it's 46, well, 6 plus 4 is 10, but 1 plus 0 is 1, so it reduces down to a 1. So you end up with basically 1 through 9 plus a 0, you end up with 10 basic gematria values, or you can just leave them as the bigger numbers. You might end up with a gematria value of a sentence of maybe 612, right? So, well, 613, that's the number of commandments that are in the Torah. So any gematria value that comes up with 613 automatically elicits the comparison or the analogy to the commandments. And if Yod, He, Vav, He, the 10th letter, the 5th letter, the 6th letter, and the 5th letter again. In fact, let me ask you guys a question just to kind of bring you up to a certain speed. Do you all know how to tie zitziot? Does anybody not know how? That's the wrong question. Okay, a few people don't know how. You that don't know how to tie them, is there anybody that does not know what a zitziot is? Everybody knows. Okay. 2 places, in Numbers and in Deuteronomy, it tells us to tie zitziot, which is, it literally means where we get the word zitzi fly in African, it means this thing that flies, right? Tie them and you will look at it, have a blue thread, and you'll remember that Yahweh is the guy who made this place, and so he gives us the instructions and we're supposed to obey them. So the Jews basically wear a shirt and they have them tied, and they might tuck them inside their pants so you don't see them, or some people wear them out, and I find that they get tangled up when I work. But the point is, there's different ways to tie them. If you tie them according to what I learned was the traditional way, you tie a double knot. You take these threads. You start out with maybe 3 feet or 6 feet. You tie a double knot, and then you will wrap either the white one or a blue one 10 wraps. And you could tie a wrap and do an overhand knot and wrap an overhand knot. It puts a little kind of a bead chain in it. Anyway, you tie it 10 times. That's a 10. That's for Yod. You tie a double knot, then you write it 5 times, that's a Hey, another double knot, then wrap it 6 times, that's a Vav, another double knot 5 times, that's Yod, He, Vav, He. Tie another double knot, then you leave the rest hanging as a fringe. But that's not the traditional way. What they do is do 7, then a knot, then 8, then 11, and then 13. What does that mean? 7, 8, 11, and 13. Well, from what I was taught, and I'm just trying to show you that very different ways of looking at things, right? When you're trying to interpret Hebrew. 7 plus 8 is 15. And we know that 15 is 10 plus 5, so there's Yod He. Why don't they just do 10, 5? They do 7 and 8. 15 equals 15, but why not just do 10 and 5? No, they do 7 and 8, that's 15. Then 11 is 6 plus 5. Well, 6 plus 5 is Vav He, so there's Yod He, Vav He, and 7, 8, and 11. But now you have to do some tricky math not that tricky, but what I'm saying is why not just put it there? And then 13 is Echad. Well, Echad is spelled Aleph, that's 1, Chet, that's 8, and Dalet, that's 4. 1 plus 8 plus 4 equals 13. So when you have 7, 8, 11, and 13, you've got Yod He, Vav He, Echad. But you had to do some math to get there. So what I do on my zitziot is I don't do any of that stuff. I just figure out a verse or a word like the word Zadika or the word Emet, or I did one that was Chaim Er Ha'olam, which means live forever. You know, I did another one that was Asha Mishpat, which is do righteousness. And so I just assign different colors, make sure there's at least one blue, or sometimes I've done 4 or 5 different blues. Wrap them up and spell different things, and so it makes them personal. Yahweh says, tie for yourselves zitziot. Now, you could go buy them if you want, or you could have somebody show you how to make them, but you can tie them for yourselves. And you can do anything you want. I know some women up at Bet Emet, they were putting beads and buttons and sequins and all kinds of beautiful things and matching different clothing outfits, and it's like, some people think that women aren't even supposed to wear them, and it's like, I don't see that stipulation in Scripture. The idea with this is to have fun with Yahweh's business. That's what I think is the important thing. So I encourage people to express yourself within the parameters of the covenant. So if you come back here now then to what do we do with these words? On page 8 is the word adar. Very similar to the English word adore. A-D-O-R-E. Adar, adore. Pretty much the same word. You can say, well, adore, that's a term of your affection towards something. Now, I don't know how many people remember, but the very first week that we were doing the alphabet, I wore a white shirt with this leather jacket on, and I barely mentioned why I was wearing it. And I remember, well, I didn't really do a very thorough explanation. But here on the chart, actually it's not on this chart, it's on that, it's probably out back. I did this alphabetic sequence, and the first letter and the last letter were white, and then the letters in between follow this color sequence. Well, it's like this. Here you go. This is white, and there's the color sequence, and ends in white. So the Aleph and the Tav are both in white. White is like the white light that until it's refracted, it has all the other colors in it, and when you refract it, it lines it up. That's the way we're looking at the alphabet, that the Aleph and the Tav are like the book covers, the Aleph and the Tav, and everything in between is the expression of the Aleph and Tav. There's verses, there's no place in the Bible where it ever tells you what Aleph and Tav mean, except in the book of Revelation, where Yeshua says, I am the Alpha and Omega. It says right there in clear English. That's a joke. He was speaking Hebrew. It's rendered as Greek letters written in English. The Hebrew would have been, I am the Aleph and the Tav. I'm the Aleph and the Tav, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. And so the image up here on this chart, in yellow here, technically it could have been white to fit the model, but I did it in yellow like light. The first letter of the word or being light is the Aleph, and didn't want the white to contrast with the white up here, which is symbolizing the linen robes of righteousness, as it were, so I made the Aleph yellow. And then the silver Tav, because the silver was used for redemption. So here at the end, the Taving of the Aleph is the redemption, or the deliverance, or the salvation, or the recompense, the evening everything out at the end. All debts being paid, canceled, accounted for, collecting a debt, all these concepts are Hebrew words. In the word Yeshua, literally means Redeemer, Savior, Deliverer, the one who indemnifies. So here you have then the ball of water like the earth. The ball of water is also the mem, so you have Aleph, Mem, Tav, as Jamie was talking about, is the word emet. Aleph, Mem, Tav. But the Tav being the last letter and the Aleph being the first letter. So here I was wearing this leather thing, and it's like, well, what does this mean? It's the word Adar in Hebrew. So I wrote up on the board here, just so you get an appreciation of the word Adar. Just to give you a concept, I've tried to encourage people to read the dictionary, even if you don't know what you're reading, and even if you don't know where to start, and you don't know how to identify Hebrew letters. This particular dictionary, again, Ernest Klein's Etymological Dictionary, if you read these words, your mind will start attaching to Hebraic concepts. And even if you don't know how to read the word, in the beginning of the dictionary, the beginning of the alphabet, and the end of the dictionary, the end of the alphabet, and you'll start getting a feel for the flow of certain concepts that are at the beginning and as you're working your way through. So here this word adore, or adar. On page 8, if you read all the way through, and again, we're not going to the phonetical dots and lines, which are the vowels in the modern Hebrew, because in Paleo, I've read that they don't even know how the words were pronounced. So if you read in modern and you have certain pronunciation keys, there's no guarantee that that's the way that David talked, or Moses talked, or Abraham, or Noah, or Adam. There's no guarantee that's the way they expressed it exactly, which means you can't really be wrong. I'm trying to give you a little feeling of more freedom to say, I got to say it just the way that so-and-so says to it. It's like, not necessarily. There's a convention that we now kind of hold to, but that's not necessarily historically accurate, just so as you know. Anyway, this word Adar means wide, high, glorious, mighty, majestic. Now, if you were going to have a test and say, write down everything this word means, you could probably write down some words not using any of those words and still get the answer right, because it's a feeling. It's a sense about the word. And one of the reasons why when I try to render these different translations, I give you a whole bunch of different words is because if I just picked one of these, I would miss the whole picture. If I said Adar meant wide and high, you picture. Now you're picturing something, but you're missing the fact that no, it's not wide and high. It's so glorious. It's, like huge, like expansive, and it's not just big and glorious, but it's also the notion of splendor, magnificence. Well, that has nothing to do with height. That's just, in my mind, it's something which is supreme, which is just like out there somewhere. That's Adar. And then also there's this time, well, wait a minute, the English word adore, no, this isn't the English word adore. But because the English word adore is so similar, you read Isaac Moseson's book, and I'm willing to bet that the feelings you have about somebody you adore is kind of the same feelings when it's talking about wide, high, glorious, majestic. And then you see that it also means a cedar, an oak, or a maple tree. Well, you look at those trees in the splendor of their magnificence, of their color, or their stateliness, and you go, wow, now that's a tree. It's the same feeling. Now, it's also the skin of an animal, which is why I happen to wear these skins for the Aleph, and I'm wearing them again on the Tav. You can say, well, what does that got to do with anything? Why am I wearing them for the Aleph and the Tav? The month of Adar is actually the 12th month, the last month. But it's in springtime, or it's at the edge of springtime. It's the end of winter, the edge of springtime, right before everything breaks open. And you could say, if we're coming back to the Tav, the sign of the covenant, I'm willing to bet that everything's just about ready to break open because we're learning Hebrew, because we're going back to the terms of the covenant. And that's what the whole next section of the talk will be here right after the break. I'm going to read you some stuff, the last words of Moses in Deuteronomy 33. Now you can read them in English and you'll see, oh yeah, he says this and this and this, but did he really say this and this? Well, in English I can see it right there, but did he really say that? When I was talking to you in 2 Samuel, I believe it's chapter 20, about the last words of David, it was the same type of thing. You read something and say, well, yeah, but I can see, I look at the dictionary, I look at Strong's Concordance, and I can see this word really does mean that. But if you take a step back and you get the feeling of the word, all of a sudden you can see it differently. It's kind of similar. Are you all familiar with something that's called a magic eye poster? It looks like wallpaper, computerized and printed. And you look at it and say, I don't know what to do with this. And you defocus your eyes and you look about 6 feet into it, and all of a sudden you see something three-dimensionally. Is there anybody that has never been able to do that or see that? You can do it? You've seen it? I could try to describe it to you, but until you experience it, you'll never know. And I've seen some that are, boy, it's easy to do, and some that are, for whatever reason, tricky, difficult to do. And it's like, gosh, and you have to keep looking. If I was looking at this flower, I focus my eyes right here. But the way this is, you're looking at the flower, but you focus your eyes as if you're looking at the carpeting. And then somehow the image appears in the middle. It doesn't appear right where you're looking. It appears, you're looking down there, but it appears here, and you have to keep your eyes like defocused in order to see it. Reading the Hebrew is very similar to that. It's where do you focus your eyes? If you focus on the gematria, if you focus on the numerical equivalents, if you focus on the Greek translation, the Latin translation, the English translation, I'm sure there's stuff there. If you focus on the historical narrative, there's something there for you. If you look at the allegorical, where you get a lot of Christian sermons, where they pull out, oh, this means this and this means that, and how do you know that's what it means? Oh, look, you can see the symbology. You can see our doctrines interpreted in these stories. Does anybody know, how do we know that the snake in the Garden of Eden was the devil? Where did it ever say he was the devil? Not in Genesis. It says nothing about him being the devil in Genesis. There's a New Testament rendering, but the point is, well, who said that? It was handed down as legend? How do we know it was the devil? I'm not going to discuss that in terms of a doctrinal matter, but I'm just saying, how do we know that what we believe is accurate? How do we know about any of this stuff? What I propose is that the accuracy that Yahweh gave us is right here in the alphabet. And so the point of studying all this is that if we can become familiar with what Yahweh intended when he gave us the alphabet, not necessarily what we've made out of it, and what our doctrines have told us that it means, but what did he mean when Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, the creator of heaven and earth, said, pick your favorite verse, pick your word, pick your whatever, and that becomes the study. So one of the things I was saying before, other days, we've got no argument with any other doctrine. If you're a Christian, Jew, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, there's no argument. You can believe anything you want to believe. Go ahead. You can make up any story you want. You can listen to any other person's story that they might have inherited from their ancestors, from their culture, You can turn over a rock and read the squiggles of a slug crawling around and try to interpret that as a secret message too, if you want to. You can read the clouds and try to get... You can believe anything you want. This class and the people that are here, I believe, are trying to study one thing. What did Yahweh say, and what did he mean when he said it? What does he want us to know? And if he said he's looking at us, there's a verse that says Yahweh's eyes, they go all over the whole earth. They're looking to and fro all over the earth. What's he looking for? What's Yahweh looking for? Now, there's a story, I believe it's in Revelation, that a certain malach, angel, messenger, is going to come. I think this is in Revelation. It might be in Daniel. But anyway, he shows up with an inkhorn and a writing implement. And he's going to put a big X on everybody's forehead. Well, it's not an X. It's a mark. He's going to put a mark. Is he going to write Yahweh's name on their forehead? I don't know what he's going to do, but he's going to put a mark on everybody's forehead. Well, we've heard of the mark of the beast. What mark is this sent messenger going to mark? Well, see, the thing about the word Tav, not only is it the last letter of the alphabet, it literally means a mark or a sign, which is pretty much like a seal. When you take a contract and somebody says, here's the terms of the contract, and they might even put a big X at the bottom. That's a tav, it's a mark. And they said, here, you sign your name. And if you're illiterate and you don't know how to sign your name, you could just write a big X. Because the X just simply means, I'm there. I agree. It's the intention behind you making the mark. And if somebody counterfeits, I'm going to scroll this X mark and say it was him that did it, and it's like, hey, I had nothing to do with that. In a court of law, you're held accountable for your intention. Though there are some who trick and connive and deceive and get you to sign your name, though it wasn't your intention, but then that becomes a legal argument. What did you intend at your frame of mind when you signed it, compared to what they're trying to weasel you because your name is here and so forth and so on? My point is, what is Yahweh's mark? What is Yahweh looking for? If Yahweh says, I am looking for a certain behavior out of my people, or I'm looking for a certain mark or a certain indicator that such and such is the case, then I'm going to do this or that. Have you ever tried to look through the scriptures and find such a notion? It's one thing to read the scriptures and just read the narrative. It's another thing for somebody to say, okay, we're going to study a certain verse, and maybe we'll read a whole chapter. A lot of sermons are rendered that way. But here's another way to read the scriptures. Get an idea. I've tried to do this with each letter of the alphabet. So what I've tried to do throughout the class, whether or not I'm successful, the proof is in the participants, you might say. Whether you guys can now see things differently or do things differently, whether or not this class is successful is all what you guys can do. There's no test, there's no scores, it's just, do you see things differently? I asked one guy, Can you say the letters of the alphabet? If you don't have them memorized, can you read them? And he got virtually them all. And it's like, there's not many people in this world that can do that. Not many people know the Paleo. Not many people even know Hebrew, especially if you're not raised in Israel or as Jewish. In fact, I've talked to some Jews before. They met on the street, and I was, oh, hey. And I started talking about the alphabet. It's like, whoa, wait a minute, slow down. They don't. I said, well, you know the down is the door, right? And they go, oh, well, gosh, I think maybe vaguely remember something about a Dalet and door. And it's like, really? These guys don't even know their own language. They don't know their own alphabet. And they might have just learned something to get a bar mitzvah when they were 10, 11, 13, whatever it is, years old, and promptly forgotten it. It's not an issue. It's not a matter. It doesn't matter. So the question is, what matters? We'll talk about that at Deuteronomy 30 and Deuteronomy 33, last words of Moses after the break, which is in about, 10 minutes or something. In the meanwhile, the point I'm trying to get you to think about is to say, if Yahweh specifically Gimels sends a messenger, and his job is to show up with an inkhorn and to write a mark on certain people's foreheads, who gets that mark? And what's the benefit to those who get the mark? And what's his determination for who gets it and who doesn't? If you add an aleph to the end of Adar, you'll get Adara, and it means a threshing floor or a circular place for the gathering assembly. Well, the thing is, a threshing floor was probably a circular place. Put a stake in the middle, tether the animal, scatter the grain on the floor, and the animal just walks around and around and around, and as he walks, he's stomping on the grain, crushing the husk off the grain, and then they get these big fans, and they take winnowing shovels, and they throw them up in the air, and the heavy grain falls, and the wind blows through and scatters the chaff out the door. So that, where would you meet if you're going to have a big meeting? Well, this is kind of a circular room in a sort, but you'd go to the big threshing place. You got a roof on it probably to keep the rains off the nice grain. And so in Hebrew thought, a round room might indeed be a threshing floor, but it's also, we're going to go to the gathering hall. It's the big round room. And so it's like when you say the word Adara, is that a threshing floor or is that a circular place for gathering? It doesn't matter what it is, it's that place where you all gather. So the interesting thing, the symbol that we use for the banner of the class, the Nun Samach, surrounded by the letters, was basically that in mind. The stake that you're tethered to, that you walk around and around and around as you're threshing the grain, we're tethered to the Nun Samach, Yeshua, and it's like the gathering, the assembly of the gathered ones, is like the assembly of all the letters are all about the Nun Samach. The life support, the living one, lifted up on the trellis apparatus. I mean, you can take these concepts and develop them and evolve them. And you might only see how far you get. You could listen to my words and say, oh, it's this and it's that. And it's like, oh, okay. And you write it down in your notes. But contemplate, meditate, ponder these ideas. The reward to you is in your doing the pondering. There's a word that means looking down. And in Hebrew, that word means also to swim. But it also means to think, to meditate, to ponder, to maybe to pray, or maybe even get sleepy. The point is, they see a picture with their head bowed, and they say, oh, he could be doing any number of half a dozen things. So that word literally can be translated, those half a dozen things. So then when you look in the dictionary, you look in the scripture, and you see that word, and you go, which one of those things is it? Is it one of those particular things? Well, now, if you're going to translate the narrative so that it reads like a story, you have to pick the best one that fits the context of the story and plug it in. But that may not be the only message. If it talks about a guy with a bowed head, you can say, well, he wasn't swimming because he was sitting in his, room, so maybe he was praying, maybe he was meditating, or maybe he just wasn't feeling good, or maybe there's this picture of I'll invoke this other story. You go, I think it was Indiana Jones, one of the movies. He was at this place and he was going through a maze, and he read this thing, Temple of Doom. And he's like, it said something about the humble man. It's like, gosh, the humble man. He goes, oh, or a penitent man. A penitent man will get down on his knees and bow his head. So he gets down on his knees and bows his head, and just at that moment a guillotine goes whoosh, and swoops right across. Had he been standing up, he would have been cut in half. And hey, that was the snare that was in that place to stop anybody from coming swiping the loot, right? So here he was saying, it's not about the penitent man. It's about what the penitent man does, which is kneel down and bow his head. And so, very interesting. You look at some of these movies and you go, the guys that write these movies, do they know how Hebrew works? They must, because you see all kinds of things embedded. Like E.T., the extraterrestrial, is actually pronounced Et, which is Aleph Tav. Aleph Tav? Who's Aleph Tav? Yeshua said in the book of Revelation, I am the Aleph and the Tav, the first and the last. I'm the guy who started this place, gave myself a foot to come walk my garden estate as the extraterrestrial. That's right, extra meaning other than beyond. The terres is where you might say is where we get the word earth. I think we went into this once before, but Aretz, Aleph Resh Zadi, we talked about that a few minutes ago. TZ is the way you pronounce Zadi, and Isaac Moseson talks about how you can flip that around. Is also ST, is also TS, is also TH, and so you have here you have the Aleph as an E sound, and this is a Resh, so you have, that's where you get the word earth, read backwards, but you read that way, it's where you get the word terra, as in terrestrial or terra firma. You know, it's the earth. So you can see even the Latin, the Greek, and the English all pull out of the Hebrew, and they spin things around and flip them upside down. But the sequence in its original format that Yahweh came right out of his heart, out of his mind, out of his mouth, is what kadosh means. Kuf, Dalet, Shin. It's translated as the word holy or sanctified or set apart, or appointed, ordained, designated, also forgiven. It was what's assigned to you. This is the special stuff that's pure Yahweh, purely his. No man's doctrines, no man's religions, no man's interpretations. So the Hebrew alphabet in the Paleo format, not the modern Chaldean flame letters, though there's a modern, you might say, rabbinical or Jewish notion that those that when Yahweh wrote with his fingers on the tables of stone, it was the fire letters of the Chaldean flame letters, but the Chaldean is the magicians and the sorcerers of the arch enemy of the Assyrians, the Babylonians. He wouldn't have taken that as the name, I don't think. But nevertheless, the point is, what's kadosh is purely Yahweh. So for me to tell you what these letters mean is not kadosh any longer. You have to ponder the kadosh to see the kadosh. And as soon as you try to tell me what it is, it's one step removed. But for Yahweh to show you the true depth of the matters of his stuff. Next week, I was going to talk about the chart for about an hour, and then we're going to have dinner for the other hour. And so again, I can't do this thing justice. But even all this, it's one step removed, maybe more than one step. But it's trying to show you where these things are. And it's kind of like the magic eye. I tell you to look and how to look, but you've got to go there. You've got to see these words. You've got to figure it out. You've got to ponder. So if you're going to ponder a word like threshing floor, circular place, how does that relate to the Nun Samach? Why do we write it in a circle? And why is the festivals in a circle? And why is the orbit of the sun around the earth? And why is the Mazarot, the constellations in their houses, a 26,000-year circle? Why did Ezekiel see a wheel within a wheel? It all has to do with the patterns that Yahweh designed, ordained, established, and stuck into being in the sky and in the language and in our consciousness and in the way that we behave with one another. All these things embed the same pattern. So to meditate on the pattern is to see Yahweh's handiwork. And remember, the first letter of Yod, He, Vav, He is the hand that creates. And it says, the heavens declare the glory of Yahweh. Who is Yahweh? We see it in the manifestation of the heavens, of the creation, of the earth, of the bugs and the birds and the flowers and the trees and the fish and the rocks. But we also see it in the design of our consciousness, the design of our attitudes, of emotions. Imagine that emotions is software programming that Yahweh designed and developed and put together the hardware as cells in our brain to conjure up emotions. Incredible. When you see a little kid, sometimes their emotions are on the surface. Adults kind of hide them. But when you see them, and then to have a face be able to express the emotions. How did he do that? There's so many muscles in the face. And every little thing, there's computer programs that police science people have that they can calculate every one, just what the motion is behind it. And people that do animation, film animation, they have all these you might have 100 pictures of Donald Duck having a different emotion, or Mickey Mouse or something, and they have to render all these so they know exactly what emotion. They're all keyed. They're very scientific. It's like, Yahweh designed that. He took a piece of clay and he designed the hardware and the software to completely interface, to have these little micro nuances of this muscle and that muscle going here, there, and you, if you pay attention, you'll know just what that person is thinking. It's like, wow, this guy's incredible. But he's revealed in his handiwork. So when we see the organization of the hardware, the DNA, the software, the thinking patterns, why does an animal emote and think? Dogs versus chimps versus chickens. Every chicken has a different personality. You wouldn't know unless you had pit chickens. Ducks too. And it's like, wow, he wired their thinking. This guy's incredible. Yahweh is incredible. And then when we see the emotions, we think, who is another human that we should so violently trample their emotions? That we should have such little regard of another person's emotions, to disdain them, to manipulate by our intention and bring them wounding harm? It's like, who are we? What are we doing? How are we trying to apply this stuff? If anything, the understanding of these things should be for us to be better people, more like Him. More like Him. And part of that has to do with the simply regarding of the dignity of not just a humanity, but the dignity of a created being with such a capacity that Yahweh Himself designed it and gave it the spark of life, the breath to be for a while. And it's like, gosh, can we set it as our personal agenda to be about the business of maximizing the life, the pleasure, the regard of another individual, instead of quenching it? If you add the letter Tav to Adarat, you'll end up with robe of state, cloak, glory, mantle. Well, here, Adar is just the skin of an animal, but if you add the Tav, the sign, the mark of dignity, we as men of the covenant, of people of Israel, Aleph and Tav with Dalet Resh in between. Dalet Resh is generation. We should be the generation of Aleph Tav, wearing the dignity of the high calling of the people of Yahweh, maximizing His expression, His revelation. We'll discuss the meaning of this shirt afterwards, but I was trying to capture a little taste of this. But besides what we wear, it should be in what we do. I feel as much as everybody, in the wrong attitude, the wrong expression, the wrong look, we have been given these tools to be as Yahweh's expression on the face of the earth, which is what the white linen represents, the Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. He made it, He put it in the Torah, He revealed it in Messiah. The white linen of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh is what we express of these things. But we can repent. We can repent and teshuvah and turn around, and He gives us another chance. And that word for repentance, though you didn't know it, is right here. And we'll talk about that in the next half. It's in the word Shabbat, which was shuvat, shuv, teshuv. We'll talk about that in a break.